I worked as a radar technician at a remote monitoring station in northern Greenland for almost 8 months before I left. Officially, the place was called Outpost K-13, but nobody used the full name unless they were filing reports. Most of us just called it K, or the station. It was one of those facilities that technically existed for weather tracking and early warning surveillance, but everyone there understood we were monitoring more than civilian traffic. I'm posting this because I still can't explain what happened during my last 3 weeks there, and honestly, I don't think anyone else from the station is going to talk about it. Half the crew signed NDAs after we got rotated out, and the other half pretend none of it happened. I tried doing that too. Didn't really work. The station sat far enough from the nearest settlement that supply planes only came twice a month if the weather held. We had around 14 people total. Radar operators, maintenance techs, communication staff, 2 security guys, and the station commander. It wasn't military exactly, but most of the equipment definitely wasn't civilian grade. The work itself was repetitive. 12-hour shifts watching radar sweeps, logging aircraft, checking transponder codes, flagging anomalies. Most nights were dead quiet. Cargo planes, research flights, occasional military traffic we weren't cleared to identify. After a while, your brain starts recognizing patterns automatically. You can tell what kind of aircraft you're looking at just from movement behavior before the system finishes classifying it. That's why I noticed the first signal immediately. It happened during a night shift in late November. Around 2:17 a.m. local time, I picked up an unidentified contact entering restricted airspace northwest of the station. No transponder, no flight registration. At first, I assumed it was a glitch because the speed reading made no sense. The system briefly estimated it at over 7,000 kilometers per hour before correcting itself. I remember laughing because I thought the software bugged out. Then the signal stopped instantly. Not faded, not lost. It just vanished in a single frame like someone switched it off. I logged it anyway and called it into command. The officer on duty sounded irritated more than concerned. He asked me to rerun diagnostics and check for atmospheric interference. I did. Everything came back normal. The next night it happened again. Same area. Same impossible speed spikes. This time there were 2 contacts moving together. They appeared for 11 seconds, disappeared, then reappeared almost 90 kilometers closer to the station. That part bothered me more than the speed. Radar glitches don't reposition themselves intelligently. I saved the recording locally before forwarding it up the chain. About 20 minutes later, the station commander came into radar operations, wearing full cold weather gear like he'd walked over from another building. He asked me to step away from the console while he reviewed the playback himself. He didn't say much afterward, just told me the contacts were false returns caused by ionospheric distortion. Then he deleted the local recording from my workstation personally. I asked why he'd bother deleting interference data if it was meaningless. He looked at me for a second and said, "Because people fixate on patterns when they spend too long out here." That answer sat wrong with me immediately. After that, the signals started appearing every night, always between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., always approaching from the same direction. Sometimes one contact, sometimes 5 or 6. The speeds varied wildly. Occasionally, the system couldn't even calculate them. The tracks would jump huge distances instantaneously, then stabilize again like normal aircraft. The weirdest thing was that they never triggered any interception response. Anything unidentified entering that airspace should have started a chain reaction immediately. Communications, verification, potential scramble coordination from elsewhere. Instead, command acted like the contacts barely existed. One night I asked Eric about it during break. He was the senior communications tech and had been stationed there longer than anyone else. I expected him to brush it off, but instead he got very quiet. Then he asked me, "You seeing them visually yet?" That caught me off guard. I asked what he meant. He just stared into his coffee for a second before saying, "Don't look outside if they get close." I laughed because I thought he was screwing with me, but he didn't laugh back. A few days later, the station lost satellite uplink for almost 6 hours during a storm. We switched to backup systems and stayed operational, but everyone was tense the entire time. During outages like that, the isolation really hits you. There's no phone signal out there. No internet except station access. No real outside contact. That same night, the radar picked up a contact only 30 kilometers from the station. That had never happened before. At that range, we should have seen navigation lights or heard engines, especially in clear conditions. But the sky outside was empty. No sound. Nothing. I remember checking the exterior cameras thinking maybe the radar was locking onto ground movement or drifting ice reflections. Every camera feed looked normal except for camera 4 facing north. The image kept freezing for half seconds at a time, not glitching exactly, more like skipped frames. While I was watching, something crossed the edge of the camera view for maybe 1 frame. It wasn't detailed enough to identify. Just a dark shape moving across the snowfield faster than seemed physically possible. Then the feed cut out completely. Security went outside to inspect the camera mast about 20 minutes later. When they came back, one of them looked pale enough that I honestly thought he was sick. Neither of them would say what they found. The next morning, camera 4 had been removed entirely. No explanation. At that point, the atmosphere inside K-13 changed completely. People stopped lingering in common areas. Conversations would end when certain topics came up. I started noticing crew members checking the windows constantly without realizing they were doing it. Sleep got difficult too. The station walls were thin in some sections, and late at night I'd hear movement outside that didn't make sense. Not footsteps exactly. More like long scraping sounds moving slowly around the outer structure. The security guys blamed shifting ice. I almost convinced myself they were right until the night I heard it directly outside my quarters window. There was a pause afterward, then 3 knocks against the glass. Soft, deliberate. I froze completely. The window looked out over open snow with floodlights covering the entire perimeter. There shouldn't have been anyone there without being visible immediately. I stayed in bed for maybe 10 minutes just staring at the curtain. Then I heard the knocks again, 3 taps. I eventually forced myself to look. There was nothing outside, but the snow beneath the window was untouched too. No footprints, nothing. The final week was when things got bad enough that people openly started talking about transfer requests. 2 crew members got into an argument with the commander after another night of erased recordings. One of them accused him of already knowing what the contacts were. The commander responded by threatening disciplinary action if anyone discussed radar anomalies outside official channels. That same night, the signals stopped behaving like aircraft entirely. Multiple contacts appeared simultaneously surrounding the station in a near-perfect ring pattern. Stationary at first, then slowly moving inward. I remember everyone in radar operations going silent while we watched it happen. No one even pretended it was interference anymore. There were 14 contacts total. The closest one stopped less than 2 kilometers away, still nothing visible outside. No sound, no lights, no heat signatures, just empty darkness beyond the floodlights. Then every monitor in operations blinked off at the same time. Not a power outage. Emergency systems stayed active, but the radar displays went black for about 15 seconds. During those 15 seconds, something hit the roof above us, hard enough that dust fell from the ceiling panels. Another impact followed farther down the structure, then another. It sounded heavy but uneven, not mechanical, like something moving across the station on multiple limbs. One of the newer techs started panicking and saying someone needed to call for evacuation. The commander ordered everyone to stay seated. I'll never forget how scared he looked when he said it. The systems came back online after maybe 20 seconds. All 14 contacts were gone. No departing tracks, no fading signals, just empty airspace. The next morning, we found deep marks in the ice around the station perimeter. Long grooves carved into the snow in looping patterns. Security blocked the area off immediately, and by afternoon fresh snowfall had buried most of it anyway. 2 days later, I got reassigned unexpectedly and flown out with another crew rotation. Nobody debriefed me. Nobody asked questions. When I tried accessing archived radar logs remotely after returning home, my credentials had already been revoked. Later, I contacted Eric through a private account to ask if things had settled down at K-13. He replied once. All he sent was, "They only come during the dark season." I never heard from him again. About 4 months later, I checked the station registry out of curiosity. Outpost K no longer appeared on the network listing I originally applied through. I figured they renamed it or folded it into another program. But when I searched satellite maps for the coordinates, the entire site was gone. Not abandoned, gone. Just flat snow and ice like nothing had ever been built there at all. I used to be a sonar operator aboard a diesel-electric submarine contracted for joint naval patrols in the North Atlantic. I'm not naming the boat or the country because I still technically signed paperwork that probably covers this. But honestly, I don't think anyone would officially acknowledge the patrol happened anyway. The mission itself wasn't unusual at first. Long underwater stretches, minimal communication, routine tracking assignments. The kind of deployment where days blur together because there's no sunlight, no fresh air, and no real sense of time outside the shift rotations. Most people think submarines are tense all the time, but honestly the scary part is usually boredom. Sonar duty especially. You spend hours listening to machinery hum, distant propellers, shifting currents, random ocean noise. After enough time underwater, your brain starts searching for patterns automatically. You notice tiny differences in sound the same way people recognize familiar voices in a crowded room. That's why the knocking stood out immediately. It happened during the third week of patrol, while we were moving through a deep section of ocean over an underwater trench. We were running quiet at the time, meaning almost everything unnecessary on board had been reduced or shut down to minimize noise output. The sonar room was dead silent except for equipment and headset audio. At around 1:10, I started hearing metallic impacts through passive sonar. Very faint at first, 3 knocks spaced evenly apart, then silence. About a minute later it happened again. 3 knocks, same spacing, same tone. At first I thought it was hull expansion or loose equipment somewhere on board. Submarines constantly make noises. Pipes shift, metal flexes under pressure, valves click. But this sound wasn't internal. The directionality was wrong. It was coming from below us. Not around us, beneath us. I marked it and reported it to the officer on watch. He listened for maybe 30 seconds through the spare headset and told me to classify it as geological activity. That answer didn't really make sense because geological sounds underwater are usually irregular. Grinding, rumbling, low-frequency vibration. This sounded deliberate. Clean metallic impacts with exact spacing between them. The weirdest part was depth. The sound profile suggested it originated deeper than the ocean floor itself. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but sonar works through timing and reflection. Whatever produced the knocking was registering below the seabed return. I reran the calculations 3 times because I thought the system was bugging out. The numbers stayed the same. The knocking continued for almost an hour before stopping completely. The next morning I mentioned it casually during meal rotation, thinking maybe another operator had heard similar sounds before. Nobody really answered. One of the older sonar guys just asked me what pattern I heard. I told him 3 evenly spaced knocks. He stopped eating immediately. Then he asked, did it repeat every minute or so? That was the first moment I started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. Turns out he'd heard it before during another patrol years earlier in the Norwegian Sea. Same pattern, same interval. According to him, command dismissed it back then too. That night I went through archived sonar logs looking for similar reports. Most classified patrol recordings weren't accessible from our terminal level, but older incident summaries still existed in the internal database. After enough searching, I found references to unexplained metallic impacts recorded during submarine operations going back decades. Different oceans, different vessels, same description, rhythmic metallic knocking from impossible depths. One report from the late 1960s included a transcript that made my stomach drop because the operator described the exact same 3-knock sequence before contact was lost with another submarine 2 days later. That submarine never resurfaced. Neither did the crew. I probably should have stopped digging after that, but being trapped underwater with information like that does something to your brain. Every sound starts feeling important. Every silence feels loaded. The patrol already had people on edge because communications with command were unusually limited during that deployment. We receive short encrypted bursts once every couple days, and that was it. Then the knocking came back. This time everyone in sonar heard it. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks again. Only now there was an echo behind it. Not a normal echo from terrain reflection, more like another set of knocks responding farther away. The officer on watch ordered active sonar suppression immediately, which confused me because we hadn't used active sonar to begin with. We were only listening passively. Still, everyone followed procedure without arguing. The captain came into sonar himself maybe 10 minutes later. I'd barely seen him outside command during the patrol, so that alone told me something was wrong. He listened through my headset for less than 15 seconds before ordering all recordings isolated from the main archive. Not erased, separated. That distinction stuck with me. A few hours later, we changed course without explanation and descended deeper into the trench area. Nobody told us why. Rumors spread almost immediately because crews onboard submarines notice even tiny navigational changes. Some thought we were tracking another vessel. Others assumed there was equipment failure. Then one of the navigation guys quietly mentioned we were following the sound source. That messed with everybody. The atmosphere onboard changed after that. Conversations got shorter. People started snapping at each other over small things. Sleep got harder too because the knocking kept returning during night cycles. Always 3 knocks, sometimes distant. Sometimes so loud through sonar, it felt like someone hitting the outer hull with a hammer. One operator refused to continue his shift after hearing it directly overhead despite sonar showing empty water around us. He swore something moved across the submarine exterior while the sound played beneath us simultaneously. The captain confined him to quarters afterward. Around the 5th night, I finally heard something different mixed into the knocks. At first, I thought it was signal distortion. Static maybe, but after filtering frequencies, I realized there were voices buried underneath the impacts. Weak, broken, almost impossible to make out. I started isolating the audio manually and eventually caught a phrase clearly enough to understand. Hull breach. Then another voice, can't surface. I thought maybe we were intercepting some old transmission bouncing through thermal layers or leftover military junk frequencies. Weird signal reflections happen underwater sometimes, but the voices kept changing. Different accents, different audio quality, different eras. One clip sounded modern. Another sounded like an old radio recording from the Cold War. One had so much static it was barely human anymore. The only constant was panic. I brought the recordings to the officer on watch, expecting him to finally admit something was seriously wrong. Instead, he looked genuinely shaken for the first time since deployment. He asked me where I found the audio. I told him it was embedded beneath the knocking frequencies. Then he asked me not to tell the rest of the crew. That answer scared me more than the sounds themselves. Later that same shift, one of the engineers came into sonar and asked why we were matching distress signatures from missing submarines. Apparently someone higher up had already compared the recordings. The voice fragments corresponded to actual naval incidents stretching back over 50 years. Some of the submarines disappeared decades apart in entirely different oceans, but the distress phrases matched our audio almost perfectly. After that, people stopped pretending the patrol was normal. You could feel the paranoia spreading on board. Nobody wanted to say certain things out loud anymore. Crew members started avoiding the lower compartments during off hours because several people claimed they heard knocking through the inner hull even when sonar was silent. Not loud knocking either, soft, patient, like someone trapped somewhere underwater trying not to waste energy. Then came the final incident. We were moving slowly along the trench edge during reduced lighting conditions when sonar suddenly lit up with multiple returns directly beneath us. Not around us, underneath. That should have been impossible because we were already near crush depth margins above the ocean floor. The contacts didn't behave like submarines either. No propulsion noise, no cavitation. Just moving shapes rising slowly from below seabed level. Every return stopped directly under our position. Then the knocking started again. Only this time it came through the actual hull. 3 knocks. The entire sonar room froze. A second later, something answered from deeper below us. 3 more knocks. I remember looking at the other operators and realizing everyone had the same expression. Nobody understood what we were hearing, but every single person on board knew it wasn't mechanical failure. The captain ordered emergency ascent procedures almost immediately after that. No explanation, no discussion, just straight ascent. As we climbed, the sonar contacts followed for several minutes before disappearing all at once. Not fading, just gone. When we finally resurfaced, the patrol ended early and we returned to port under complete communication restriction. Intelligence personnel boarded before anyone else. They took recordings, logs, even handwritten notes from sonar stations. During debriefing, they told us the sounds were caused by unusual tectonic resonance conditions. Nobody believed that, especially after one of the intelligence officers accidentally referred to the knocking as recurring. I left submarine work 6 months later. A while after that, I started digging through naval archives online and found references to distress recordings from lost submarines. Some were publicly available, most weren't. But one thing kept bothering me: the timestamps. Several voice fragments we recorded on board belonged to submarines that disappeared before our vessel was even built. I still have a copy of part of the audio saved privately. I don't listen to it often anymore. But sometimes late at night, if I play the recording at very low volume through headphones, I can hear something underneath the distress calls. Very faint, metallic knocking, still repeating in the background behind the voices. I'm not giving the exact location because I genuinely don't know if the place officially exists anymore. On paper, it had been abandoned since the early 2000s after some kind of containment incident forced evacuation of the underground sectors. The company handling cleanup went bankrupt years later, and eventually the government outsourced perimeter security to contractors. That's where I came in. The facility was enormous. Most of it sat above ground. Rusting industrial buildings, collapsed storage tanks, empty laboratories stripped clean decades ago. But the important sections were underground, 9 sectors connected through reinforced access tunnels beneath the main compound. Only the upper 2 sectors were considered safe for limited maintenance access. Everything below that had supposedly been sealed permanently after the evacuation. That was the official story anyway. When I arrived, the supervisor running orientation spent more time explaining where not to go than teaching actual procedures. Certain corridors were off limits. Certain elevators no longer existed. Certain doors were never to be opened even if alarms activated behind them. I remember joking that it sounded like the setup to a horror movie. Nobody laughed. There were only 6 of us rotating security shifts across the whole property. Most nights involved driving perimeter routes, checking fence sensors, and monitoring old surveillance systems from the administration building. Half the cameras barely worked, and the other half looked like they were held together with electrical tape and luck. The strange thing was how much power the site still consumed. For a place supposedly abandoned, the underground grid stayed fully active 24 hours a day. Backup generators cycled regularly too. When I asked why, another contractor named Petrov told me the underground ventilation systems could never be shut off completely. I asked what they were ventilating 15 years after evacuation. He just shrugged and changed the subject. The first weird incident happened during my second week. I was reviewing camera feeds around 3 a.m. when lights suddenly activated in Sector 9. That immediately got my attention because Sector 9 wasn't supposed to have power anymore. The camera itself only showed a concrete access corridor leading toward a sealed blast door. No movement, no visible people, just fluorescent lights flickering on one section at a time deep underground. I assumed it was electrical malfunction until the motion sensors activated too, one by one, like something was walking through the corridor. I called it in over radio expecting someone else to panic, but the supervisor sounded more annoyed than concerned. He told me to log it as false activation caused by legacy wiring. Then he ordered me not to send maintenance down there. That part bothered me immediately. If the systems were malfunctioning, why avoid checking them? The next night it happened again. Same corridor, same lights. Only this time the camera caught movement. A person walked past the far end of the hallway for maybe 2 seconds. White protective coveralls, full respirator mask, carrying what looked like a clipboard. I replayed the footage 6 or 7 times because I genuinely thought maybe it was another guard screwing around underground. But there was a problem. The timestamp showed the movement occurred inside a section sealed since 2011. I checked access logs afterward. No doors had opened. No elevator movement registered. According to the system, nobody had entered the underground sectors at all. That's when I started asking questions the older contractors clearly didn't want to answer. Petrov finally admitted the facility had never been fully abandoned. According to him, small maintenance crews still occasionally worked below ground under government oversight. He claimed they rotated in secretly every few months to inspect storage systems. I asked why none of us were informed about that. He said, because then you start wondering what they're maintaining. After that conversation, I started paying closer attention during overnight shifts. The underground activity became impossible to ignore. Lights turning on in sealed sectors, motion detections at impossible hours, Elevator systems activating even though the shafts to lower sectors had supposedly been filled with concrete years earlier. Sometimes entire sections of the surveillance grid would briefly come online despite being listed as permanently offline in maintenance records. The footage itself was always strange too, not dramatic. That's the part that got under my skin. Just ordinary-looking workers moving through underground corridors like the facility was operating normally. Men and women in protective gear carrying equipment cases or pushing carts, occasionally stopping to talk to each other outside rooms that officially no longer existed. No panic, no urgency, just people calmly working underground in a place everyone above ground insisted was empty. One night I decided to check the archive room myself. Most records on-site were physical because the digital systems kept failing. Buried inside old maintenance binders, I found evacuation reports from the original incident. Large sections had been removed entirely, but one detail kept appearing repeatedly. Sector 9 remains active. Not contaminated, not unstable, active. That wording stuck in my head immediately. A few nights later, I finally saw something directly instead of through cameras. I was doing a perimeter sweep near one of the sealed freight entrances around 2 a.m. when I noticed light coming from beneath the blast door. Not emergency lighting either. Bright white industrial lights moving underneath like people were working inside. I approached close enough to hear noise on the other side. Voices, metal equipment moving, distant machinery humming. It sounded like a fully operational facility beneath the ground. Then I heard someone cough directly behind the door. Not a weird monster sound or anything dramatic, just an exhausted human cough. That honestly scared me more than anything else up to that point. I radioed the supervisor immediately and told him there were definitely people below ground. There was a long silence before he responded. Then he asked me one question. Did they notice you? I remember standing there confused because that wasn't remotely the response I expected. Before I could answer, the lights beneath the door shut off instantly. Complete silence followed. No voices, no machinery, nothing. The supervisor ordered me back to administration immediately afterward. When I returned, he was already waiting in the monitoring room looking genuinely nervous. He told me never to approach Sector 9 entrances again under any circumstances. I asked him directly who was down there. He said, people who were never evacuated. That answer messed me up for days. According to the official incident timeline, everyone assigned to lower sectors either escaped during the chemical leak or died during containment failure. But after hearing activity below ground firsthand, I started wondering if some crew had been sealed inside intentionally. The security footage got worse after that. Entire groups of workers started appearing on camera regularly. Sometimes 20 or 30 people moving through underground checkpoints. Some footage showed cafeteria areas operating normally. Others showed laboratory rooms active with equipment. The timestamps were always current. One recording even showed a janitor mopping a hallway beneath Sector 9 while music played faintly through ceiling speakers, like an ordinary workday underground. I copied several clips onto a personal drive because by then I knew nobody would believe me otherwise. 3 days later, the files vanished from the drive completely. Not corrupted, deleted. Around that same time, I started noticing another detail in the footage. None of the workers ever looked directly at the cameras. At first, that sounds meaningless, but think about it. People naturally glance toward visible security cameras constantly without realizing it, especially in industrial facilities. These people never did, not once. Then came the incident that finally made me quit. I was alone in the monitoring room during night rotation when every underground camera activated simultaneously. All 9 sectors, corridors, laboratories, storage rooms, dormitories, places that were supposed to be abandoned 15 years earlier were fully lit and operational. Hundreds of people moved through the facility, workers talking, security personnel walking patrol routes, scientists reviewing monitors. It looked like the evacuation had never happened. Then every person on every camera stopped moving at exactly the same time. Not gradually, instantly. The entire underground facility froze. Every single person turned toward the nearest camera simultaneously. Even people who shouldn't have known where the cameras were positioned. I remember sitting there unable to move while dozens of camera feeds showed motionless workers staring directly outward. Then one of them smiled. Not exaggerated or creepy. Just a tired-looking middle-aged man in a lab coat smiling faintly into the camera like he recognized someone. A second later, every feed cut to black. The lights inside the monitoring room flickered off briefly. Then I heard elevator alarms activating somewhere below the building. One by one. Sector 4, Sector 5, Sector 6, descending upward toward the surface. I grabbed my things and left before the elevators reached ground level. I didn't even finish the shift. About a month later, I tried contacting Petrov to ask what was really inside Sector 9. His number had been disconnected. Another contractor I knew claimed the facility had been permanently demolished shortly after I left. But last year, I found something online that brought everything back. A satellite image uploaded to a mapping forum. The facility was still there. And in the middle of the compound, one section of snow had melted completely above the underground sectors, like something beneath the ground was still generating heat. I worked county emergency dispatch for 4 years before quitting last fall. Most people don't realize how exhausting the job gets after a while. You spend entire shifts listening to people during the worst moments of their lives. Accidents, overdoses, domestic calls, suicides, house fires. Even when nothing major happens, your brain stays tense because you know something eventually will. Night shift was always the worst. Fewer operators, longer silence between calls, and too much time to sit with your own thoughts while staring at blinking lines and dead monitors. That's when the Asheville calls started. Asheville was a small mountain town about 70 miles north of the county center. Technically, it no longer existed. A wildfire tore through the area 6 years earlier during a drought season and basically erased the place. Most of the residents evacuated. A few people died, and whatever survived afterward was condemned because the utilities and roads were destroyed. I never visited it myself, but everyone in the county knew the story because it became a huge news event at the time. There were documentaries, charity drives, lawsuits over failed evacuation alerts. The entire area was eventually fenced off because of unstable terrain and abandoned structures. The first call came in around 1:40 a.m. during a slow Thursday shift. At first, it sounded normal enough. Bad connection, lots of static, a woman breathing hard like she was driving while talking. I went through the standard script asking for location and emergency details. She said, "We're stuck on Birch Road. The fire crossed the highway." I started pulling up maps automatically while asking how many people were with her. Then she said, "Please tell them to open the north route this time." That wording caught my attention immediately. This time. But before I could ask anything else, the line started breaking apart. I could still hear her talking through the static. She kept saying people were trapped near the church because traffic wasn't moving. Then she asked me what year it was. I honestly thought it was either a prank or someone having some kind of breakdown. I repeated my question about her exact location. She answered, "Asheville. We're still in Asheville." The line disconnected right after that. I logged it as a possible mental health situation because weird calls happen constantly in dispatch. People drunk, confused, hallucinating, whatever. I didn't think much about it until the next night when another call came from the same disconnected area code. This time it was a man. Lots of shouting in the background, vehicle horns, wind. He sounded terrified. He kept asking if evacuation buses were still coming. Said smoke was too thick to drive through, and people were abandoning cars on the road. I asked for his location, and he immediately answered, "Near the elementary school." Same town, same wildfire, same panic in the background. I muted my headset and asked another dispatcher if she remembered Asheville. She looked confused and said, "Yeah, why?" I told her about the calls. She got quiet for a second before asking what they said. Apparently, I wasn't the first person to receive them. That's when things started feeling genuinely wrong. According to her, random dispatchers had been getting similar calls for years during overnight shifts, never consistently, maybe once every few months, sometimes more often during wildfire season. The callers always described the evacuation in progress like it was happening live. Roads blocked, smoke everywhere. People trapped trying to leave town. Nobody could explain it because the phone records always came back corrupted or incomplete afterward. I asked why nobody escalated it officially. She just shrugged and said, "Management tells people not to talk about it." That answer bothered me more than the calls themselves. After that conversation, I started paying attention whenever unknown lines came through overnight. Most were normal, but every so often another Asheville call would appear. Different voices every time. Same situation, always mid-evacuation. One elderly man sounded almost calm while describing flames moving through the tree line behind his house. He asked if firefighters had reached town yet. When I told him the department had no active incident at that location, he went silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "No active incident." I still remember how confused he sounded. Not scared, just confused. like my answer didn't fit whatever reality he was experiencing. Another caller was a teenage girl whispering from inside a bathroom while people screamed outside. She kept asking if the highway tunnel was open because her father said they'd suffocate in traffic if the wind shifted. Then she suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence. I thought the line disconnected until I realized I could still hear faint movement, breathing. Then very quietly she asked, "Why do you keep answering?" That question stayed with me for weeks. The strange thing was how detailed the calls felt. People weren't describing generic disaster scenes. They mentioned specific streets, local businesses, names of town officials, landmarks that actually existed in Asheville before the fire. One caller even gave me an address that later matched an old insurance report I found online. I started researching the wildfire obsessively after that. The official timeline never made complete sense. Reports conflicted constantly about evacuation orders. Some articles claimed the town cleared out early. Others suggested communication failures trapped residents longer than authorities admitted. Then I found archived forum posts from survivors. A lot of them mentioned hearing emergency sirens repeating non-stop throughout the night after power failures began. Several described people receiving conflicting evacuation instructions, depending on what part of town they were in. One comment stuck with me more than anything else. Somebody wrote, "It felt like we kept driving in circles no matter which road we took." The calls became more frequent after that, sometimes multiple in one shift, and they started overlapping. One night I had 2 separate callers from Asheville active simultaneously. One claimed they were stuck near the gas station, while another described sheltering inside the community center across town. Both sounded completely real. Both begged for evacuation updates. I remember placing one caller on hold briefly to answer another emergency line, and when I returned, she sounded irritated. Not panicked, irritated, she said, "You left us waiting again." Again, that word hit me immediately. I checked timestamps afterward and realized something weird. The Asheville calls almost always came between 1 and 3 a.m., which matched the estimated period when the original wildfire overwhelmed the town years earlier. It was like the same few hours kept replaying. Then came the call that finally made me quit. It was near the end of shift, around 4 a.m. I almost ignored it because the connection quality looked terrible on the system display. When I answered, all I heard at first was fire alarm tones and heavy static. Then a man started speaking very calmly. No panic, no yelling. He asked if evacuation routes were finally clear. I started going through standard questioning automatically, but halfway through he interrupted me. He said my full name, not just first name, full name. Then he thanked me for staying on the line this time. I felt cold immediately. Dispatchers don't give names during emergency calls unless necessary, and I had definitely never spoken to this person before. I asked who he was. He ignored the question and started describing the fire moving through town in detail. He mentioned burning power lines falling across roads, abandoned vehicles clogging intersections, people trapped at the church parking lot. Then he said something that genuinely messed me up. "There are more of us here now." I remember asking what he meant. He replied, "The ones who answer eventually stay." Right after that, I heard another operator's voice in the background behind him, not from my dispatch floor, from the call itself. A woman calmly repeating standard emergency instructions. I recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to a dispatcher named Elena who disappeared 2 years earlier after finishing a night shift. They assumed she left town voluntarily because her car vanished too, but I knew that voice. The caller continued talking while Elena's voice repeated directions faintly in the background like she was handling other emergency lines somewhere nearby. Then the man said, "She answers quickly now." The line disconnected after that. I sat there for probably 30 seconds staring at my screen before realizing the call log had vanished completely from the system. No timestamp, no recording, nothing. I went home sick that morning and never returned to dispatch after that week. A few months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I drove north toward the old Asheville access roads. Most routes were still blocked off, but you could get close enough to see remnants of foundations and burned tree lines beyond the fences. There's still no cell service out there. At least there shouldn't be. I was sitting alone near one of the barricades watching the wind move through the dead trees when my phone suddenly started ringing. Unknown number. I answered before thinking. For a few seconds, all I heard was static and distant sirens. Then a tired female voice asked, 911, what's your emergency? I froze. The voice sounded exhausted, like someone at the end of a very long shift. Before I could respond, I heard dozens of other voices in the background. Men, women, children, all talking at once, all asking for help. Then I heard Elena, clear as day. She was taking another call somewhere nearby. The same calm dispatch voice she always used. The line crackled. A man came on next. "Can you hear us?" I couldn't answer. My throat felt locked shut. The static grew louder. Then the man said something I still think about almost every day. "We finally reached someone." The call ended. I drove home immediately and never went back to that area again. That was 8 months ago. I still keep my phone on silent at night. Every now and then I wake up and check it anyway. No missed calls, no voicemails, nothing unusual. But sometimes, usually between 1 and 3 a.m., I'll unlock my screen and find the call app already open. No active call, no record of one either. Just the keypad sitting there waiting. Maybe it's a software glitch. Maybe I'm imagining things. Or maybe somewhere beyond those burned hills, the evacuation never actually ended. Maybe the people of Asheville are still trying to get through. And what bothers me most is that part of me still wonders what would happen if I answered again. My older brother worked corrections for a few years before transferring into private security work. He's not really the type to exaggerate stories, which is why this one stuck with me. Even when he told it, He sounded more uncomfortable than dramatic about the whole thing. This happened sometime around 2018 when he took a temporary overnight contract at an old detention facility in the desert outside Nevada. Officially, the place had been shut down years earlier after the military transferred operations elsewhere. Most of the buildings were empty and waiting for demolition, but because the site still stored records and equipment, a small security crew rotated through to keep trespassers out. According to him, the facility felt wrong immediately. Not haunted or movie creepy, just abandoned in a way that didn't seem natural, like people had left too quickly. Offices still had paperwork stacked on desks. Old cafeteria menus were still pinned to bulletin boards. One hallway apparently still had coffee mugs sitting inside a break room covered in dust. The strangest part was the prison wing underground. That section had originally been built during the Cold War for military detainees and later got reused for intelligence holding operations after 2001. By the time my brother arrived, the lower blocks were supposedly empty and permanently closed off. Only they still ran nightly head counts. At first, he assumed it was leftover procedure embedded in the shift schedule. Bureaucratic nonsense nobody bothered removing. Every night around 1 a.m., the guards on rotation had to walk certain cell blocks, confirm security doors, and radio inmate counts back to central monitoring. The weird thing was the forms already had names printed on them. Not inmate numbers, names. Every single night, the count sheets listed the same 37 detainees assigned to Block D. My brother noticed it during his second shift. He asked the supervisor why they were still doing inmate counts for an empty prison wing. The supervisor just said, "Because we're required to." That answer apparently irritated him because nobody could explain who was requiring it. The military no longer operated the facility. Most of the prison staff were long gone. The place barely had enough funding to keep lights on in half the buildings. But every night, exactly at 1 a.m., someone still performed count. My brother eventually got assigned to assist with Block D rounds alongside an older guard named Mercer who'd worked the site since before decommissioning. According to him, Mercer treated the process way too seriously for an abandoned prison. They had to walk cell by cell with flashlights even though every room was empty. At each door, Mercer would stop briefly, check the slot window, then quietly say a number under his breath before moving on. When my brother joked about counting ghosts, Mercer apparently snapped at him hard enough to end the conversation immediately. That was the first red flag. The second came a few nights later when my brother reviewed archived incident logs during downtime. Several names on the count sheet matched people officially listed as missing. Not escaped, missing. Some had military backgrounds, others were foreign nationals. One was apparently a journalist detained overseas before vanishing during transfer custody years earlier. Most had no confirmed death records, no release paperwork either, just missing. After that, he started paying attention during rounds. Block D sat beneath the older sections of the facility, behind reinforced blast doors thicker than anything else on site. The cells themselves looked strange too. No bars, just heavy steel doors with narrow observation, windows, and restraint points bolted into concrete floors. The kind of place clearly designed for long-term isolation. My brother said the first genuinely unsettling thing happened during one of Mercer's head counts. They reached cell 14 when Mercer suddenly stopped walking. Then he stepped backward slightly and waited. My brother asked what was wrong. Mercer told him quietly, "You moved too fast." Apparently, there was an exact pace they were supposed to follow during count. My brother laughed because he thought the guy was messing with him. Then Mercer asked him if he'd heard the knocking yet. That question bothered him because right as Mercer said it, there actually was a sound somewhere down the corridor. Metal tapping, very faint, 3 knocks. My brother checked every visible cell window immediately. Empty. The sound stopped after a few seconds. Mercer refused to discuss it afterward. Things escalated slowly after that. At first, it was small stuff. Cell doors showing unlocked indicators briefly before correcting themselves. Motion sensors activating inside sealed rooms. Old intercom speakers crackling with distorted voices during overnight shifts. The staff blamed faulty wiring constantly, but according to my brother, maintenance crews almost never entered Block D anymore. Nobody wanted to stay down there longer than necessary. One night central monitoring called asking why count was delayed. The problem was my brother and Mercer hadn't even started count yet. According to the log system, someone had already begun walking the block 10 minutes earlier using Mercer's access credentials. Security footage showed nothing, just empty corridors. But the electronic checkpoints were still activating one by one down the hallway exactly as if somebody invisible was moving through them. After that, my brother started noticing another weird detail. Every night during head count, the inmate total stayed consistent. 37 present, always. Didn't matter what sensor faults occurred or what systems malfunctioned. The final count never changed. Then came the incident that made him seriously consider quitting. He was alone that night because Mercer called out sick. Central assigned him to complete Block D rounds by himself despite him protesting over radio. According to him, the prison felt unusually quiet that shift. Even the normal building noises seemed muted underground. When he reached Block D, the blast door was already open. He knew for a fact it should have been sealed because he personally checked it earlier. Inside the corridor, every cell light was on, not flickering, fully active. That had apparently never happened before. My brother radioed Central immediately asking if maintenance teams were inside the block. No response came back, just static. He almost turned around right there, but protocol required completing the round if the security door was breached. So he went in. He said the strangest part wasn't seeing anything unusual at first. The corridor looked completely normal except for the lights. Empty cells, concrete floors, silence. Then he noticed the doors. Several observation slots were open. He swore they'd been closed before. As he passed cell 8, he glanced automatically through the slot window and froze. There was a food tray inside, fresh, steam still rising off it. He backed away, immediately thinking somebody had broken into the facility somehow. Then he noticed movement farther down the corridor. Not clear movement, more like silhouettes shifting briefly behind the narrow windows as he walked past. He told himself it was lighting distortion. But the deeper he moved into the block, the more obvious it became that some cells weren't empty anymore. Not fully occupied either. Just shapes sitting motionless in darkness where no one should have been. He radioed Central again, demanding backup. Still nothing except static. Then the intercom system activated overhead. A calm, automated voice said, "Prepare for nightly count." My brother said every cell door lock clicked immediately afterward, one after another down the corridor, not opening, unlocking. That's when he started backing toward the exit. Then he heard Mercer's voice behind him quietly say, "Don't run during count." The problem was Mercer wasn't supposed to be there. My brother turned around and saw him standing near the entrance holding a flashlight. Except Mercer looked wrong somehow. Pale, exhausted, uniform older than the one he wore currently. Before my brother could say anything, Mercer looked toward the cells and started reading names from the count sheet, one by one. And after each name, something inside the cells answered, not loudly, just soft voices saying, "Present." My brother told me hearing that nearly made him pass out because some of the voices sounded weak or confused, like people waking up somewhere they didn't understand. Others sounded completely normal. A few spoke with accents. One sounded like a child. He said the worst part was realizing the voices came from cells that should have been physically empty. Mercer continued reading calmly while my brother stood frozen near the exit. Every name matched the missing persons listed on the sheets. Then Mercer reached the final name and stopped. Silence followed for several seconds. Then a voice somewhere near the end of the block quietly asked, "Are we being transferred?" My brother said Mercer looked genuinely upset hearing that. Before he could respond, all the cell lights shut off simultaneously. Complete darkness. A second later, emergency alarms started blaring throughout the prison. When backup finally arrived, Block D was empty again. No food trays, no open slots, no voices. Just my brother alone near the entrance looking like he was about to throw up. The official report blamed stress and exhaustion. Mercer denied being present during the incident entirely. That's the part that really bothered my brother afterward because security logs showed Mercer never entered the facility that night. 2 weeks later, my brother quit the contract. Before leaving, he copied several archived count sheets onto his phone. He showed me one once. The weird thing wasn't the names. It was the dates. Some of the detainees were still marked present years after their official disappearances. And every single form ended the same way. Count VERIFIED, 37 remaining. My brother never talks about that job anymore. Not because he's scared. At least that's what he says. But every time somebody mentions military prisons, missing persons cases, or government detention programs, he gets quiet. A few months ago, I finally asked him what he thought was really happening in Block D. For a long time, he just stared at his drink. Then he said something that honestly unsettled me more than the story itself. He told me he doesn't think those head counts were meant to keep track of prisoners. He thinks they were meant to make sure the prisoners were still there. I laughed and asked why that mattered if the place had been abandoned for years. He looked at me for a second and said, "Because they kept answering." That was the end of the conversation. At least I thought it was. A few weeks later, I got curious and started searching some of the names from the count sheets online. Most of them led nowhere. Old articles, archived reports, missing person bulletins, dead links. But eventually I found one name that caught my attention. Mercer. Same first name, same last name. Listed as missing during a military transport operation in 2009. I honestly assumed it was a coincidence at first. Then I saw the photograph. It was him, same face, same age, same man my brother worked alongside. I called him immediately. The moment I mentioned the article, he went completely silent. Then he asked me to send him the link. About an hour later, he called back. The first thing he said was, "Delete it." I asked him why. He ignored the question. Instead, he asked whether the article mentioned if Mercer had ever been found. I told him no. The report still listed him as missing. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then my brother quietly said, "That means they counted him too." The line went dead a few moments later. I haven't brought it up since, but every now and then I still think about that facility sitting out in the desert, about the empty cells, about the voices answering roll call from rooms that should have been vacant, and about a head count that continued long after everyone was supposedly gone. Because if my brother was right, somebody is still walking through Block D every night at 1 a.m., still reading names, still waiting for answers. And the thing that bothers me most is wondering what happens if one night a voice finally stops responding. A friend of mine worked offshore for almost 5 years on deep-sea drilling rigs in the Gulf before he quit and disappeared back home. We weren't super close or anything, but he used to tell stories whenever he came back into town between rotations. Most of them were normal work stuff. Equipment failures, brutal shifts, guys fighting over stupid things after being stuck together too long at sea. But there was one story he only talked about once, and even then he sounded like he regretted bringing it up halfway through. This was maybe 3 years ago. We were drinking behind a repair shop after closing, and somehow the conversation drifted toward weird offshore accidents. That's when he mentioned a mechanic named Collins. According to him, Collins had been on the same rig for years. Quiet guy, mid-40s maybe. Apparently everybody liked him because he stayed calm during emergencies and knew the machinery better than half the engineers on board. Then there was an accident during a drilling operation about 200 miles offshore. My friend never explained exactly what failed because he wasn't directly involved in the drill systems. But something went wrong deep below the platform during pressure testing. Not a full blowout, but close enough that alarms triggered across multiple sections of the rig. They lost power briefly and had to shut operations down while emergency systems kicked in. During the outage, part of the lower maintenance crew got trapped near one of the flooded equipment corridors. Collins was down there when it happened. They eventually recovered everyone after maybe 40 minutes, but according to my friend, Collins came back different afterward. Not injured exactly, just wrong. At first, people assumed he was in shock. He barely spoke during meals and started staring off during conversations like he was distracted by something nobody else could hear. A medic on board tried evaluating him, but Collins insisted he was fine. Then weird things started happening around him. The first incident sounded harmless enough. One of the crane operators walked into the mess hall complaining about coffee quality before he even opened his mouth. Collins responded with, "Yeah, they burned it again." The operator laughed and asked how he knew what he was about to say. Collins just shrugged. Nobody thought much about it until it kept happening. People would start conversations, and Collins would answer before questions were finished. Not guessing either. Actual responses to things nobody had said yet. One worker joked that Collins was reading minds. Apparently, Collins looked genuinely uncomfortable after hearing that. My friend said the atmosphere on the rig slowly got tense over the next week because once you notice something like that, you can't stop paying attention to it. At first, everybody tried rationalizing it. Maybe he was just good at reading expressions or predicting routines. Offshore work gets repetitive. Same people, same schedules, same conversations every day. But then Collins started responding to things there was no way he could anticipate. One night during maintenance checks, my friend was walking with another mechanic discussing a hydraulic issue they planned to report in the morning. They hadn't spoken to anyone else about it yet. Before they even reached the equipment bay, Collins walked past them and said, "Control already knows about Pump 3. They're shutting it down tomorrow." Then he kept walking. The shutdown order came through less than an hour later. Stuff like that kept piling up. Crew members started testing him deliberately, changing subjects mid-conversation, writing questions down instead of speaking, trying to catch him slipping. Sometimes it failed completely. Other times he'd answer too early by accident. That was apparently the worst part. He didn't act smug or creepy about it. According to my friend, Collins looked exhausted all the time, like he was trying very hard not to say certain things out loud. The rig supervisor eventually pulled him aside after several complaints from crew members. Nobody knew exactly what was said during that meeting, but afterward Collins stopped talking almost entirely unless necessary. Then came the incident that convinced my friend something was seriously wrong. Around 2 a.m. during storm conditions, one of the drill technicians got into an argument with another worker near the elevator shaft. My friend wasn't there for it, but people nearby said Collins suddenly stood up during dinner and told everybody to move away from the east stairwell. No explanation, just said it urgently enough that several workers actually listened. Less than 2 minutes later, a suspended equipment container broke loose during the storm and crashed through part of the stair structure. If people had still been standing there, it probably would have killed them. After that, nobody joked about Collins anymore. People started avoiding him instead. My friend said the rig became weirdly quiet whenever Collins entered a room. Conversations stopped. Some workers got paranoid. He was listening to private discussions before they happened. Others thought the drilling accident caused brain damage or exposure to something underground. There were rumors too. Apparently, during the original accident, Collins had been trapped alone near the damaged drill section longer than anybody else. One worker claimed rescue teams found him sitting calmly in complete darkness before emergency power returned. Another rumor said Collins kept insisting the accident had happened before already, not metaphorically, literally, like he remembered living through it more than once. My friend didn't believe that part initially until he overheard Collins talking to the medic late one night. According to him, Collins sounded terrified. Not confused, terrified. He kept asking the medic what date it was, then arguing when the answer didn't match whatever he expected. At one point he apparently said, "No, this is earlier than last time." The medic reported him for psychological evaluation after that, but evacuation got delayed because of weather. So Collins stayed on board another 4 days. That's when things escalated. People started noticing Collins reacting to conversations before they physically happened, not just predicting topics, actually responding several seconds early. One guy described asking a question and hearing Collins' answer before he finished speaking. Another claimed Collins flinched before loud noises occurred. My friend personally witnessed one incident that bothered him enough to eventually quit offshore work entirely. They were repairing equipment in one of the lower machinery compartments when Collins suddenly grabbed his arm and pulled him backward hard enough to knock over a toolbox. A pipe ruptured overhead less than a second later, exactly where my friend had been standing. Scalding steam filled half the compartment instantly. My friend asked Collins how he knew that was going to happen. Collins apparently stared at him for a long time before saying, "Because you died there yesterday." That line alone would have sounded like dark humor if not for the way Collins said it. Completely serious. By then people were sleeping badly on board. The isolation out at sea made everything worse because there's nowhere to escape uncomfortable people on a rig. You eat together, work together, sleep in the same steel structure surrounded by black ocean for weeks. And Collins kept getting stranger. He started avoiding clocks entirely, covered the digital display in his quarters with tape. Sometimes he'd stop mid-conversation and look physically sick if someone mentioned future schedules or countdowns. Then he began warning people about tiny things before they happened. Dropped tools, power flickers, phone calls from home, arguments, small injuries, always seconds or minutes ahead, never wrong. Eventually, the company sent a helicopter to remove him during bad weather despite normally avoiding evacuations under those conditions. According to my friend, that alone scared everybody because it meant management was desperate to get him off the rig quickly. The helicopter arrived just before sunset. Collins looked relieved when they told him he was leaving, but right before boarding, He supposedly grabbed the supervisor and said something quietly that nobody else heard. The supervisor went pale immediately afterward. Then the helicopter left. About 40 minutes later, communications with it were lost during the storm. They never found wreckage. Officially, the aircraft crashed into the ocean. But the part that messed my friend up most happened afterward. The next morning, before anybody informed the rig crew about the missing helicopter, Collins walked into the mess hall soaking wet. Not injured, not panicked, just exhausted. According to my friend, the entire room went silent because nobody understood how that was possible. The helicopter had vanished hundreds of miles offshore overnight. One worker asked him where he came from. Collins sat down slowly and apparently said, "I tried leaving this time too." Then he looked around the room and added, "You need to stop the drill before Thursday." My friend said that was the exact moment he realized Collins genuinely believed he was reliving the same events repeatedly. The rig shut operations down 2 days later after another major pressure anomaly beneath the ocean floor. And according to my friend, Thursday never came for Collins, because sometime during the night before shift change, he disappeared from the platform completely. No alarms, no witnesses, no body recovered from the water, nothing. But that wasn't the end of it. Weeks later, after crews rotated back to shore, my friend received a voicemail from an unknown number while sleeping. The message was only a few seconds long. Static, ocean noise. Then Collins' voice saying, "This one lasts longer than the others." My friend deleted the voicemail immediately after hearing it. He still regrets that now. At least that's what he told me. But a few months after sharing the story, I ran into him again and asked if he'd ever found out what happened to Collins. For a second, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Then he told me there was one detail he'd left out. Apparently, the day after Collins disappeared, the supervisor gathered everyone for a private meeting. No official report, no paperwork, just a warning. The supervisor told them that before boarding the helicopter, Collins had asked him a question. Not a prediction, a question. He wanted to know how many times the rig had already been evacuated. The supervisor told him once. Collins laughed. Then he said, "Only once this time." After that, he boarded the helicopter. My friend said nobody understood what that meant until months later. Because after Collins vanished, company investigators reviewed archived drilling records connected to the original accident. Buried inside the files were references to pressure anomalies that matched the same incident almost perfectly. Not once, not twice, dozens of times over several years, different crews, different supervisors, different dates, but always the same equipment failures, the same flooded corridor, the same section of damaged drill infrastructure, almost like the rig kept repeating parts of its own history. Most people wrote it off as coincidence. My friend didn't. Neither did the supervisor. The supervisor retired less than 6 months later. Before leaving, he reportedly told another worker something that eventually made its way around the crew. He said Collins never acted like someone seeing the future. He acted like someone remembering it. That story still bothers me more than it probably should. Not because I believe Collins was trapped in some kind of time loop, and not because a helicopter disappeared. Offshore accidents happen, people vanish at sea, records get messed up, but every now and then I remember that voicemail. This one lasts longer than the others. And I can't stop wondering what he meant by this one. Because if Collins really was reliving the same stretch of time over and over again, then maybe he wasn't warning people about the future at all. Maybe he was warning them about something that had already happened. Again, and again, and again. And the thing that still keeps me up at night is wondering whether he ever found a version where he actually got off that rig.